It was a moment so brief, so subtle, most people would have dismissed it entirely. But for Officer Jack Miller and his loyal German shepherd, Balto, the flash of something beneath the dust and rubble in the old storage area of Westfield Mall would mark the beginning of a chilling journey, one that would unravel the darkest secrets the mall had ever hidden. Jack's heart pounded as Balto tugged on the leash, eyes locked on a rusted metal container half buried under layers of broken concrete and forgotten boxes. "Hold up, Balto," Jack murmured, his voice steady despite the growing unease in his gut. The mall had been under renovation for months, a construction project that seemed harmless enough. New stores, brighter lights, and more parking spaces. But today was different. Today, a sealed box, old, battered, and wrapped in thick, weathered duct tape, had surfaced like a long-buried ghost from the past. And just like that, the past came rushing back, uninvited. Jack took a deep breath, squatting beside Balto, his mind racing. This wasn't just a random discovery. The memories flooded back like a movie reel on fast forward. Emily Lawson. Missing. Gone without a trace. 1995, he had only been a rookie back then, barely in his second year on the force. The case had haunted him for years. He had seen the cold stares of her family at every vigil, heard the whispers in the hallways of the department about the unsolved case that no one could crack. But now, 12 years later, the answers they'd all been waiting for might just be buried right here. Jack's pulse quickened as he motioned for the construction workers to clear the area. He had already made up his mind. No one was touching this until the police arrived. "Get the team," Jack said to one of the workers, his voice firm but calm. This could be a crime scene. Jack stood up, his boots scraping against the cracked tile of the mall's once bustling food court. It was eerily quiet now, the familiar hum of food court chatter replaced by the distant sound of hammers and drills. But Jack's focus was sharp, zeroed in on the container buried beneath the years of debris. Balto's tail flicked nervously. He could feel the weight of the moment, just as much as Jack did. For a moment, it was like time itself had frozen. This was the same mall where Emily Lawson had vanished all those years ago. The same mall where a young woman had disappeared, and no one had ever figured out what had happened to her. The story of Emily's disappearance was burned into the minds of the entire city. She had been 18, vibrant, and full of promise, visiting the mall with her friends that autumn afternoon. The mall had been packed, but when her friends turned around to find her, she was simply gone. No one saw her leave. At first, there were hopeful leads. The mall's security cameras had been scoured frame by frame, but the footage was blurry, and the timeline didn't make sense. There were whispers about possible suspects, but nothing ever panned out. The case went cold, slipping into the pile of unsolved mysteries. In the end, Emily's family had to move on without closure, and Jack, still haunted by that unsolved case, could never let it go. As Jack watched the workers carefully lift the metal box from its resting place, the knot in his stomach tightened. He had been involved in plenty of cases, seen his fair share of crime scenes, but this? This was different. This was personal. The box was heavier than expected, its metal frame corroded with rust, but still intact. When the workers pried it open, Jack held his breath. The air was thick with dust as they peeled back the lid, revealing the forgotten contents inside. There, nestled at the bottom of the box, were a handful of items, personal belongings that told a story Jack never expected to hear again. A wallet, its edges frayed with age. A small notebook, its pages yellowed and fragile, but still legible. And what caught Jack's eye the most, a set of keys, the same keys Emily had been carrying when she vanished that fateful day. The silence was deafening as Jack took a step back, his hand gripping the leather leash tightly as Balto remained at attention. His mind raced, the flood of emotions impossible to suppress. Was this really it? The moment he had been waiting for, the moment he could finally bring justice to Emily's family? Emily Lawson, Jack whispered to himself, almost as if speaking her name would make the truth real. The case that had haunted him for over a decade might finally have an answer. But there was still one question Jack couldn't shake: why here? Why now? As the police tape went up and the crime scene unit arrived, Jack's thoughts spun. His gut told him something was wrong. This was no simple discovery. Someone had hidden these items intentionally. Someone had wanted them to stay buried. Jack looked down at Balto, whose watchful eyes seemed to know more than anyone else in that moment. Together, they were about to uncover secrets no one had dared touch for over a decade. The truth was buried deep, but Jack and Balto were determined to unearth it. This was just the beginning. The case had only just been reopened, and already, Jack could feel the tension rising. There was something bigger at play here, something darker, and it was up to him and Balto to bring it all into the light. The journey ahead would be a tough one. It would require more than just determination and skill. It would take every ounce of Jack's experience, and every bit of trust he had in Balto, to crack this case wide open. Jack Miller felt the familiar knot in his stomach as he stood next to his K-9 partner, Balto, watching the construction crew work tirelessly to uncover what was buried beneath the old storage area of Westfield Mall. The renovations had been going on for weeks now, and the dust was beginning to settle over the once bustling shopping center. But today, something different was happening. The crew had hit something. It wasn't just a pile of old trash or unused inventory. No, this was something far more significant. Jack had been called over by Tony, the foreman, around 2 p.m. and had found a section of the floor that had been hastily covered by concrete years ago. It wasn't the type of thing you'd expect to find during a regular renovation. Something had been deliberately hidden. Jack leaned over the exposed metal container. It was rusted, worn, and covered in layers of grime, but it was still intact. Whoever had buried it had made sure it stayed buried. The sealed container was small, roughly 3 feet by 2 feet, and wrapped with what looked like duct tape around the edges. Balto's ears perked up, and his tail began to wag, but Jack could sense the tension in the dog's stance. Balto's training kicked in as his nostrils flared, picking up the faint scent of something familiar. Something unsettling. "Do you think this is what I think it is?" Tony asked, wiping sweat from his brow. Jack didn't answer right away. His mind was already racing back to 1995, when he was just starting out in security at a local mall. There was something about this whole situation that felt wrong. He could almost hear the echo of that year in his thoughts. The case from then had never really been solved. Jack had always wondered if things might have turned out differently if the right pieces had come together. He glanced at Balto, who was clearly agitated. There was no denying it now, this wasn't just any old forgotten storage container. Whatever was inside might just hold the answers to a question that had haunted him for years. The disappearance that had rocked the community. A young woman, gone without a trace. "Tony, don't touch it," Jack said firmly. "Get the team to back off. We're treating this like a crime scene. I'm calling this in." Jack pulled out his phone, but he was already ahead of himself. He knew exactly who he needed to call. Detective Mason Rivera. She'd been working cold cases for years, and if there was anyone who could help him crack open the mystery surrounding this container, it was her. When Detective Rivera arrived, she was already alert to the gravity of the situation. She was sharp, always assessing the scene with a mix of caution and curiosity. Rivera had seen it all, or so she thought, but there was something in the air that told her this case was different from all the others. Jack explained what they had found, but his gut told him they were just scratching the surface. "I've been doing this long enough to know when something feels off. And this feels like a part of something bigger." Rivera gave him a look that said she understood exactly what he meant. She quickly reviewed the area and made a decision. "We need to get this to the lab for proper analysis. No opening it here." The container was carefully extracted, but the sense of dread never left Jack's chest. He'd seen too many cases where a missing person's name slowly faded away, becoming just another unsolved tragedy. But this time, he hoped it wouldn't be like that. Not if Balto could help him find the right answers. Back at the station, Jack sat alone in his office with Balto by his side, the weight of the day's events pressing on him. The contents of the container were being processed, and Rivera was already on her way back to the lab to oversee the examination. Jack knew it was only a matter of time before they found something that would link the container to a past case, and he was prepared for whatever would come next. His phone buzzed with a text from Rivera. "The contents are a match. It's Emily. Get here as soon as you can." Jack's heart skipped a beat. He'd been expecting it, but hearing the confirmation still hit him hard. Emily Lawson. It had been years, but the connection was undeniable. The last known sighting of her was in this very mall. Her friends had searched for hours after they'd lost track of her. But she'd never been found. The contents of the container were personal items, things Emily had been carrying with her the day she vanished: a set of keys, a driver's license, and a silver bracelet. But there was something more, something that sent chills down Jack's spine. A journal. The familiar handwriting sent a pang of recognition through him, and the last entry, dated October 23, 1995, was the hardest to read. In those final lines, Emily had written about feeling uneasy, about someone following her at the mall. Her words were laced with anxiety. "I can't shake the feeling. Someone is watching me. I don't know who, but I feel like I'm being followed. I can't go on like this." Jack turned to Balto, who was now standing by his side, sensing the weight of the moment. He rubbed the dog's head, more for comfort than anything else. "We're going to find out who did this, buddy. And we're going to make sure they pay." The journal continued to lay open in front of Jack, with the final, most haunting part, RH. The initials were all Jack needed. Richard Holbrook. It was a name that had been buried deep in the investigation files, an unassuming mall security supervisor who had been quietly dismissed after the case went cold. Jack had never believed the story Holbrook had given when they'd questioned him back in the day. Jack's hands shook as he closed the journal and looked at the photo of Emily that was now pinned to the investigation board. It was the same photo that had once been distributed to every news station in the area, the face of a missing woman who had been lost in time. But this time, Jack wasn't going to let her become just another forgotten case. The next day, Jack and Balto returned to the mall, determined to find more answers. Balto's nose was sharp, and Jack trusted him more than anyone else. As they retraced Emily's last steps, Jack couldn't help but think of the time lost. Of all the people who had failed to see what was right under their noses. The search led them through hidden areas of the mall, places most people never noticed, the corridors where old security footage tapes were stored, long-forgotten service entrances, and abandoned rooms where the past had been hidden away. Balto's movements were methodical, his instincts on point as he tracked down the faintest traces. Jack knew it wasn't just the past that needed to be uncovered now. The truth was buried somewhere, waiting to be found. And with Balto at his side, he was going to make sure it stayed uncovered. The scent hit Balto first. Officer Jack Miller had always trusted the dog's instincts, and Balto's sudden shift in focus told Jack they were on the right track. His K9 partner, a large German shepherd, lifted his nose to the air, sniffing the ground as they stood near the old storage room. It was quiet now, with the mall nearly deserted due to the ongoing renovations, but the sense of history weighed heavily on Jack's chest. They had stumbled upon something important. Something buried for far too long. The construction crew had uncovered an old, rusted metal container buried beneath years of forgotten debris. It was a rare sight. Everything from the smell to the weight of the container screamed that it had been there for much longer than the mall's renovation had been in motion. Jack's eyes narrowed, and he felt his pulse quicken as the container was pulled from the ground. He watched as Balto remained still, his eyes trained on the container as if waiting for a command. Jack gestured for the crew to back off. He could feel it deep in his gut. There was something about this discovery that wasn't just random. "Don't touch it until the police arrive," Jack said firmly, his voice cutting through the buzz of the construction site. It was a simple order, but in his experience, it was the kind of directive that could save lives, if his suspicion was correct. He knew what he had to do next. Without wasting another moment, Jack pulled out his phone and dialed for backup. "We've got something here," he said into the receiver. "Call Detective Rivera. This is big." While waiting for the police to arrive, Jack stepped back, his eyes scanning the area. His mind drifted to the years of service he had spent as a police officer. Every day on the job had taught him to trust his instincts, and today, his gut told him they had just uncovered a key to an unsolved case that had haunted the city for years. Balto, still on edge, let out a low growl as Jack knelt down to inspect the container more closely. It was clearly older, perhaps even older than the mall itself. The metal was corroded in places, and Jack could tell that it had been sealed for decades. He touched the edges, feeling the sticky residue of duct tape clinging to the sides. Whoever had sealed this knew exactly what they were doing. They had made sure that it would never be opened, not until now. When Detective Patricia Rivera arrived on the scene, she was quick to take charge. Jack had worked with her enough to know that she would be thorough, and right now, that was exactly what they needed. She was a seasoned investigator, and Jack respected the way she handled cold cases. But even Rivera couldn't hide her shock when she saw what had been unearthed. "Is this," she started, but Jack didn't need to answer. She already knew. "It's been buried for years," he said. "Look at the duct tape. This wasn't a random find." They opened the container slowly, treating it like an ancient artifact rather than just a rusted box. What they found inside was enough to make Jack's stomach turn. The first items they pulled out were Emily's personal effects, her driver's license, a high school class ring, and a set of keys that had once belonged to her. Jack's heart sank. This wasn't just some piece of forgotten history. This was evidence of a life that had been lost. "Is this Emily Lawson's stuff?" Detective Rivera asked, her voice soft but sharp, as if she already knew the answer. Jack nodded, his mouth dry. He hadn't wanted to say it out loud, but there was no denying it. The handwriting on the back of the driver's license was unmistakable. This was real. Emily, the young woman who had vanished from the Westfield Mall nearly 15 years ago, had been buried right under their noses. They carefully removed a journal from the container. It was worn, the pages yellowed with age, but still legible. The last entry, written just before her disappearance, caught Jack's eye. It was brief, but it was chilling. "I feel like someone's been following me again today. I don't know why, but it's like I can't get away from them. I keep seeing him everywhere, in the corners of my vision. I'm scared. I have to tell Mom when I get home. I can't be the only one who feels this way. The name RH keeps coming up in my mind. What does that mean?" Jack's mind raced. RH. He knew that name. It wasn't just a random set of initials. Richard Holbrook. The security supervisor who had worked at the mall all those years ago. The same man who was now the general manager, with years of experience covering his tracks. "Detective, I think we've just found our prime suspect," Jack said, his voice low but filled with urgency. "I remember him. I worked with Holbrook back in the day, and something about him never sat right with me. He was always too calm, too controlled, especially after the investigation started." Rivera looked at him sharply. "You think he's involved?" Jack didn't need to respond. The journal entry, the items buried with Emily, and the connection to Holbrook, it was all pointing in one direction. Richard Holbrook had been watching her. He had been stalking her. And now, Jack was certain, he had been involved in something much bigger than just one missing girl. "We need to talk to him," Rivera said, her tone firm. "But this is just the beginning. There's more here than we've uncovered. If Holbrook was involved, then there are more victims we haven't found yet." Jack watched as Rivera began making calls, pulling in the resources they would need to investigate further. As they waited for the lab results and for further backup, Jack stood by Balto, who remained alert, his gaze never wavering from the area they had just uncovered. Jack's mind raced as he thought about the events of the past several hours. His instincts had been right, there was more to this than just a long-forgotten storage room. And Balto had known it all along. The case was finally starting to unravel, and with it, the truth that had been buried for so long was beginning to surface. But the deeper they dug, the more Jack realized that uncovering the truth would come at a price. Balto's growl echoed in the distance, as if to remind Jack that this was just the beginning. Jack had always trusted his instincts, but this case felt different. The walls of the Westfield Mall, once bustling with shoppers, now seemed to whisper secrets that had been buried for over a decade. Every corner, every hallway, was filled with echoes of the past, but it was the faintest of clues, often overlooked, that led Jack to the truth. Balto, his loyal K9, was the key. Together, they had uncovered pieces of a mystery that no one else had noticed, a cold trail that was now heating up fast. The discovery of the container buried beneath the storage area had sent a wave of shock through Jack. As the forensic team processed the items inside, his mind raced. The wallet, the keys, the notebook, all belonged to a young woman, someone he'd seen in the case files but never fully understood. The journal with the last entry, detailing the eerie feeling of being watched, was especially chilling. The initials, RH, stood out to him like a neon sign. They weren't just random letters, they were the keys to unlocking the mystery. But who was RH? Balto was still sniffing around the area, his alert eyes scanning the room as Jack crouched to inspect the ground more closely. The dog had a way of sensing things others couldn't. His nose was on something again, faint but unmistakable. He trotted a few feet forward, pausing at a corner of the old security office. Jack moved closer, wondering what the dog had picked up this time. The faintest trace of a scent lingered in the air, familiar, yet unsettling. The office, long forgotten and hidden behind piles of dust and debris, seemed like a graveyard of lost memories. The old security footage had been untouched for years. Jack could feel the weight of every discarded tape, every forgotten memory locked inside these walls. But there, among the boxes and the faded posters, he found something that made his pulse quicken, a security camera feed from 1995, dated just weeks before the container had been buried. It was a long shot, but Jack had no doubt it held the answers. He rushed to the control room, Balto right beside him, as he powered up the old equipment. The footage flickered to life, crackling with static. The images were grainy, but Jack could make out the familiar layout of the mall. He watched as a young woman, clearly the same one whose belongings they'd found, walked through the corridors. She looked out of place, nervous even. Her gaze darted around the mall, and it was clear that she felt someone was watching her. Jack's eyes narrowed. He recognized the signs of someone trying to hide their fear. As the footage continued, Jack saw her enter a store, then disappear from view. But there was something odd about the footage. The camera angles shifted, and for a few moments, the scene went blank. When the feed returned, the woman was gone. Jack leaned in closer. It wasn't just the footage, it was the timing. The gaps in the tape weren't random. Someone had tampered with it. Someone who didn't want certain things to be seen. Balto growled, his low, steady rumble cutting through Jack's thoughts. The dog had picked up another scent, this time stronger. Jack grabbed his radio and called in for backup, though he already knew what he had to do. Holbrook was at the top of his list. The mall's security supervisor. The man who had controlled everything. And, Jack feared, the man who might be behind it all. Jack's hands trembled as he dialed the number for Holbrook's office. He wasn't sure what he expected, but the call was answered on the first ring. "Officer Miller," Holbrook said, his voice smooth and controlled. "How can I help you?" "I need to speak with you," Jack replied, his tone steady, though his mind was racing. "We have some questions about the security footage from 1995. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, followed by a low chuckle. "I see. Is there something specific you need to know?" Jack's instincts told him that Holbrook was hiding something, but he couldn't prove it yet. "I'd like to meet with you. In person." "Of course. I'll be here all day. We can discuss whatever you like." Holbrook's voice remained calm, but Jack could hear the faintest edge of something beneath the surface. Fear? Guilt? It was hard to say, but Jack knew this conversation would go nowhere unless he was face to face with the man. When Jack arrived at Holbrook's office, he found the man sitting behind a large mahogany desk, looking every bit the part of the well-respected mall manager. He had aged since the 90s, his hair graying at the temples, but his sharp eyes were still as calculating as ever. The security supervisor rose from his chair and offered Jack a polite handshake. "Officer Miller," Holbrook said, his smile tight. "What brings you to my office today?" "I've been reviewing some old case files," Jack began, his eyes never leaving Holbrook's face. "And I'd like to ask you a few questions about the security protocols back in '95. Holbrook nodded as he gestured for Jack to sit. "Ask away." "I've been looking at the footage from the day Emily Lawson disappeared. The footage shows her walking around, but then it cuts out, entire chunks of the tape are missing. Do you have any idea why that might be?" Jack asked, watching Holbrook's reaction closely. Holbrook didn't flinch. "We had some issues with the equipment back then. Nothing unusual." "Is that so?" Jack pressed, leaning forward slightly. "Because it seems like the equipment was working just fine for the rest of the mall that day. Only certain sections had gaps. Would you care to explain that?" Holbrook's eyes flickered, but only for a fraction of a second. "You're reading too much into it. It was a long time ago." Jack kept his gaze steady. "We also found some unusual work orders from the day after Emily disappeared. Emergency repairs on a storage area that had no water damage. Do you remember signing those?" Holbrook's face hardened, but he didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for a glass of water on his desk and took a long sip. "That's standard procedure. I don't remember the specifics, but I assure you, everything was above board." Jack wasn't buying it. "Funny thing, I'm not the only one asking questions. It seems like you've been keeping a lot of things under wraps, Holbrook. And now, a lot of it's starting to come to light." Holbrook's eyes narrowed. "I don't appreciate being accused of anything. If you have any real evidence, you'll be the first to know." Jack stood up, still staring at the man across from him. "You might want to start thinking about how much you want to protect. Because we're just getting started." As Jack left the office, Balto trotted beside him, ears perked, his eyes locked on the door they'd just exited. There was more to this story than Jack had first thought. And he was determined to find out the truth, no matter how long it took. Jack had been in law enforcement long enough to know when something didn't sit right. Every lead felt like a loose thread that, when pulled, might unravel a truth that had been hidden for years. Balto, his German Shepherd K9 partner, stood by his side, eyes sharp, nose twitching, and every muscle in his body tense, waiting for Jack's next move. The investigation had taken him deep into the Westfield Mall's history, uncovering the cold, lifeless edges of a case that had been closed for over a decade. The discovery of the sealed container buried under the mall's old storage room had opened a door to the past. What had once seemed like an isolated incident now appeared to be part of a much darker pattern. Jack's gut told him that someone, was trying to bury the truth. And whoever that was had done it well. Balto's nose twitched again as they moved further through the mall. The renovation crews were long gone for the day, leaving behind only the eerie silence of the vast, empty spaces. The hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional sound of their boots echoed in the hallways. Jack stood still for a moment, his breath steady but his heart racing. "Come on, boy," he muttered, signaling for Balto to move ahead. The dog's ears perked up as he took off, leading Jack into the dimly lit corridor that stretched behind the food court. The scent trail Balto was following wasn't just any trace. It was old, covered in dust and years of disuse. It was almost as though the dog had picked up something that had been left behind purposefully, waiting to be uncovered. They reached the end of the corridor, near a set of old storage lockers. Balto suddenly stopped, his tail stiff. Jack squatted down beside him, his hand gently resting on the dog's shoulder. Balto's nose nudged a rusted metal locker, and Jack's pulse quickened. He'd seen this kind of behavior before. It was the same way Balto acted when they were on a search for missing persons, sniffing out the smallest of clues. "Good boy," Jack whispered. They worked quickly, not wanting to waste any time. Jack forced the locker door open. It creaked loudly, the sound slicing through the silence like a warning. Inside was nothing but old mall documents, dust-covered receipts, and long-forgotten supplies, except for one thing. A manila envelope, yellowed with age, wedged between two boxes of unused security equipment. Jack pulled the envelope free, his fingers trembling as he opened it. Inside were old, weathered photographs of women, young women, some of whom Jack recognized from the files he'd read over the past few days. The images were casual snapshots taken in the mall, shopping, laughing, posing for pictures with friends. But what chilled him was the date and time stamped on the back of each one, dates from the months leading up to the mysterious disappearances. But it wasn't just the photos that made his blood run cold. It was the note that came with them, written in neat handwriting: "Keep watching. Don't let them slip away." Jack felt a sudden coldness settle over him. It was as if someone had been keeping tabs on these women long before they vanished, tracking their every move. The note felt like a warning, a chilling confirmation that they were not dealing with a single crime but a deliberate, calculated pattern. His mind raced as he thought about Holbrook, the mall's former security supervisor. Holbrook had been well respected, a professional who'd served the mall for years. But as Jack looked at the photos, he couldn't help but wonder, had Holbrook been the one watching these women? Had he been the one pulling the strings behind the scenes? And if so, how far did this go? Balto sniffed the envelope once more, his ears flicking back, eyes focused on Jack. The dog's reaction wasn't one of uncertainty, but something more primal, something more disturbing. Balto knew what Jack was beginning to suspect: they weren't just chasing ghosts. They were hunting down the shadow of someone who had used his position of authority to manipulate and control, someone who had left a trail of victims behind. The next few hours were a blur. Jack returned to the security office, the one where he'd first encountered Holbrook's tampered footage. With his heart pounding, Jack went through the footage again, carefully examining the details: what had been erased, what had been ignored. It was slow, tedious work, but it paid off. There, buried deep within the layers of old surveillance data, was a glimpse of Holbrook on camera, interacting with several of the young women from the photographs. He appeared calm, professional even, but there was something in his eyes, a glint of something darker. Jack leaned back in his chair, his mind spinning with the implications. He had known something was off about Holbrook. The man's calm, controlled demeanor during the initial investigation had always seemed too perfect, too rehearsed. It now made sense. Holbrook had been part of a much larger operation, an operation that Jack was determined to shut down once and for all. The next day, Jack set out to dig even deeper. As the mall continued its renovation, Jack spent hours speaking with former employees, piecing together a timeline of Holbrook's activities. His gut told him that the repairs Holbrook had authorized were far more than just routine maintenance. They had been strategic, calculated moves to cover up the crimes he had committed. But Jack still needed more evidence to tie Holbrook to the women who had gone missing and, worse, to the buried remains they were certain would be found beneath the foundation. With Balto leading the way, Jack followed the scent trail through the remains of the storage area. The concrete had already been dug up, but there was a strange, undeniable pull at the back of Jack's mind, something telling him that the final piece of the puzzle was just within reach. Balto stopped suddenly, his tail wagging low, his body tense with purpose. Jack looked down at him and saw something in the dog's eyes, something that told him they were close, closer than ever. Jack knelt beside Balto, feeling the weight of the moment pressing in on him. He knew the truth was just ahead, and with it, the justice that these victims, these innocent women, deserved. "Let's do this, Balto," Jack said, his voice steady, the resolve in his heart burning brighter than ever. The truth was within their grasp. They just had to dig a little deeper. Jack was standing in the dimly lit storage area, his hand resting on the worn, rusted surface of a long-abandoned filing cabinet. Balto, as always, was at his side, standing alert, his nose twitching as he scanned the room. The place smelled of old wood and musty air, a reminder of the many forgotten years this part of the mall had been sealed off. Despite the stale air, Jack felt a strange sense of urgency, like they were on the verge of something big. "Come on, boy," Jack muttered, nudging Balto forward. "Let's see what we can find." Balto's ears perked up, and he trotted ahead, his paws clicking against the concrete floor. Jack followed him closely, his flashlight cutting through the shadows. The old filing cabinet creaked as he pulled it open. The drawer was heavy, filled with old paperwork, receipts, and outdated security reports that had never been properly filed. As he flipped through the pages, something caught his eye, an old security report marked with the date October 23, 1995, the same day the young woman had disappeared. Jack's stomach turned. The more he read, the more the puzzle pieces began to fit. This report wasn't just a regular log, it was a detailed account of the mall's security activity, and one name stood out repeatedly. Holbrook. Of course, Jack muttered to himself. Holbrook had been everywhere, in every corner of the mall. He'd been in charge of the entire security operation at the time, yet the report was suspiciously thorough, almost too meticulous. It seemed like Holbrook was covering his tracks. The questions that had once been buried deep in Jack's mind began to resurface. Was it possible that Holbrook had been the one orchestrating everything? Could he be the man behind the series of strange disappearances over the years? Balto's snout pressed into another crack in the wall, and Jack followed the dog's lead. They came across a spot where the concrete had been disturbed. The air around them grew colder, and a sense of unease settled in Jack's chest. Balto's tail was stiff, his posture rigid, signaling that something significant was close. Jack knelt down and examined the floor. The crack was deeper than it seemed, as if someone had made a deliberate effort to cover something up. "Help me, boy," Jack whispered. Together, they worked at it, Balto sniffing around the edges of the crack while Jack used his flashlight to illuminate the surrounding area. Finally, the faint glimmer of a hidden object appeared. Jack knelt lower and used his hands to pry up a section of the floor, uncovering a thick, weathered metal box beneath. His pulse quickened as he examined the box. The lid was slightly dented and covered in grime, but it looked solid, like it had been buried here for years, untouched. With his flashlight in one hand and his other gripping the box, Jack pried it open. His heart raced as he peered inside. The contents were eerily familiar. There, inside the box, were several personal items, photographs of young women, jewelry, and a few pieces of clothing, all neatly folded. It was clear that this box had been kept hidden away, its contents carefully preserved, like trophies. Among the items was a distinctive charm bracelet, one that had been reported missing after a woman disappeared from the mall in 2001. "God damn it," Jack muttered under his breath. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Holbrook hadn't just been involved in one disappearance, he had been involved in multiple. And all these years, he had been hiding the evidence right beneath their noses. Jack snapped a photo of the items and took a mental note. It wasn't just a coincidence that these women's personal belongings were here. There had to be more. The pieces were slowly falling into place, and Jack was beginning to see the true extent of the crimes Holbrook had been committing over the years. Balto barked sharply, pulling Jack's attention away from the box. He turned to see the dog standing in front of an old maintenance door, one that had long been forgotten. Jack's heart skipped a beat. Could there be more? Without hesitation, he walked over to the door and pulled at the handle. It creaked open, revealing a narrow hallway that led deeper into the building. Jack motioned for Balto to lead the way. The dog's nose twitched as they moved through the corridor, and Jack could feel the tension in the air. They reached the end of the hallway, where another door stood ajar, seemingly untouched. Jack's instinct screamed that this was it, the final clue that would crack the case wide open. The door opened with a slow, unsettling groan, and Jack stepped inside. The room was cluttered with old equipment, boxes, and forgotten furniture, but something about it felt off. As his flashlight swept across the room, it landed on a large storage cabinet tucked away in the far corner. Jack's breath caught in his throat. The cabinet was locked, but the rusty padlock didn't deter him. He pulled it off, his mind racing with possibilities. Inside the cabinet was a stack of old, faded documents. Jack carefully sifted through the papers, and his eyes stopped on a file labeled Employee Records, 1995. His pulse quickened. Could this be what he'd been searching for? He thumbed through the records and froze when he saw Holbrook's name. But this wasn't just a regular file, it contained detailed reports on various security officers from that year, including notes on their interactions with certain customers. Then, Jack found it. There it was, an entry that detailed Holbrook's interactions with several women, including notes about their shopping patterns, their locations in the mall, and even the stores they frequented. The notes were disturbing. Holbrook had been watching these women closely, making note of their every move, and even directing his officers to follow them. Jack felt a chill run down his spine as he realized what this meant. Holbrook hadn't just been observing his victims, he had been tracking them, manipulating his security staff to help him do so. This wasn't just about one or two women, this was a pattern of systematic abuse, and Holbrook had been doing it for years. Balto's sharp bark snapped Jack back to the present. The dog was standing at the door, his stance rigid as if he sensed something Jack didn't. Jack walked over and paused, the weight of the evidence in his hands sinking in. He had it, he had the proof that Holbrook was responsible for far more than anyone could have ever imagined. It was time to confront him, to bring the truth to light. As the investigation reached its breaking point, Officer Jack Miller stood at the heart of a cold case that had finally been thawed. With Balto, his ever-loyal K-9 partner by his side, Jack had uncovered the buried truth behind Emily Lawson's disappearance, a truth that had been hiding under layers of concrete for over a decade. But it wasn't just Emily. The deeper Jack dug, the more he realized that Holbrook's actions were part of a much larger, darker pattern. The mall, once a symbol of everyday life, had become a place where trust was shattered, and danger lurked beneath the surface. The final lead came on a quiet morning when Balto, sniffing around the last uncovered section of the mall's old storage area, froze. His stance was rigid, his nostrils flaring with intensity. Jack watched, heart pounding as Balto's paws dug into the dirt. Jack had seen this behavior before, it was more than a scent, it was a breakthrough. "Good boy, Balto," Jack whispered, as he knelt down beside the dog. The ground felt different here, like something hidden for years was now just a breath away from being exposed. Jack reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his flashlight and a small shovel. He needed to be sure. The weight of this moment pressed against him, but he kept his focus. As he carefully removed the top layers of dirt and debris, he felt the hard edge of something solid. His pulse quickened, realizing that what lay beneath was more than just a simple lead, it was the final clue. In moments, the shallow grave came into full view, and there it was. Emily's personal items, still preserved in their original state, partially buried under what seemed like years of forgotten history. Balto stood beside him, quietly, but Jack could feel the tension in the air. The sense of closure was almost palpable, but they were far from done. What he'd just unearthed was damning, but it was only the beginning of a confession that would tear the veil off a chilling truth. Jack immediately called in the crime scene team. The discovery of Emily's items was crucial, but it wasn't enough to stop Holbrook's reign of terror. They needed more, something that could tie the man directly to the scene, to the pain he had caused for years. By the time the police forensics team arrived, Jack was already reviewing his notes, piecing together the timeline. The confession was inevitable now. Holbrook had left behind too many signs, too many mistakes. The investigation had revealed not just one crime, but a series of systematic, calculated actions that spanned over a decade, all hidden beneath layers of secrecy and manipulation. Once they had the evidence from the storage area, Jack prepared for his final confrontation with Richard Holbrook. This time, he was ready. Holbrook couldn't hide anymore. His actions, his lies, his very role in the destruction of so many lives had finally caught up with him. When Jack and Balto confronted Holbrook in his office, the man's composure was gone. Holbrook knew the walls were closing in. But even as he sat there, trying to maintain his calm, Jack saw the cracks in his facade. The way his hands trembled slightly. The sweat building on his forehead. It wasn't just guilt. It was fear, fear of facing the truth. "You know why I'm here," Jack said, his voice steady. "It's over, Holbrook. We know what you've done." Holbrook's face hardened, but Jack could see the resistance faltering. The weight of everything he had buried, literally and figuratively, was becoming too much to carry. Balto sat quietly at Jack's side, sensing the moment of victory. Holbrook may have been a man of authority once, but in that room, it was Balto and Jack who held all the power. Holbrook's words finally broke the silence. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he muttered. "I never meant to hurt anyone." Jack could barely hold back the disgust he felt. "You've been hiding behind your badge for too long, Holbrook. You're not fooling anyone now." Holbrook's confession spilled out, like a dam breaking. He admitted to stalking Emily and other victims, explaining how he had manipulated the system to protect himself. The truth about the construction work, the secret graves, and the buried evidence all came to light in that moment. When the confession was over, Holbrook was arrested, but Jack didn't feel the sense of relief he expected. He felt exhaustion. Relief would come later, when the families of the other victims finally knew the truth, when they had the closure they deserved. The case was officially closed, but Jack knew this was more than just the end of an investigation. This was about justice for the victims who had been silenced, for the families who had waited too long. And for him and Balto, it was a reminder that the job was never truly done until every last bit of truth had been uncovered. As Jack stood outside the mall, watching the police vehicles drive away, he finally allowed himself a moment to breathe. It was over, but the scars left by Holbrook's crimes would remain forever. He glanced down at Balto, his constant companion in this fight for justice. "Good work, buddy," Jack whispered, scratching Balto behind the ears. "We did it." As the sun set, Jack's phone buzzed. It was a message from Emily's family, thanking him for bringing closure to their daughter's case. The message brought a small smile to his face. No, it wasn't enough to undo the pain. But it was a step forward, a victory, however small, in a world that often felt broken. Jack looked out at the horizon. He knew there would always be more work to do. But for tonight, he allowed himself a brief moment of peace. Thank you for following this journey. What do you think would have happened if Balto hadn't been there to uncover the truth? Would the case have ever been solved? Let me know your thoughts below.